Good evening, Clyde Owan, class of 79 of the Oberlin Club of Washington, D.C. Welcome to our program exploring the concept and art of green Japan. And this is the club's first of 5 offerings to help us get through the February blahs. So fellow volunteer Karen Buck-Burgess, class of 72, will introduce our speaker. Karen was a public interest attorney. She's a former Oberlin trustee, and she's now a docent at the National Museum of Asian Art. Karen has initiated several club programs through her imagination and connections. Thank you, Karen, for being involved. So why don't you tell us about tonight's presentation and presenter? Over to you.
Thank you, Clyde. And hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm thrilled to introduce to you today one of my favorite people, although I've never met him in person, Dr. Kevin Greenwood. I'll start with his impressive credentials. Kevin is the Joan L. Danforth Curator of Asian Art at Oberlin's Allen Art Museum. He arrived in Oberlin in 2014 after finishing his graduate studies and obtaining a PhD from the University of Kansas. He lives in Oberlin with his wife, Gilles, who's also a curator at the museum, and his 2 children. As an art historian, his research interests are very broad, ranging from Chinese painting to Buddhist art, to contemporary Asian art, even to Chinese and Japanese garden architecture. His most recent exhibits at the Allen include one on contemporary Japanese ceramics, called Form and Emptiness, as well as the exhibit he'll talk about tonight, Green Japan, Images of Sustainable Living, and Ukiyo-e Prints. Now, I left Oberlin many years ago in 1972. So how did I meet Kevin? Through the pandemic. Like many of you, I spent hours trolling through the internet trying to find something to get my mind off the virus and to expand and enhance my knowledge. I'm a friend of the Allen Art Museum, and I came upon their website that included a number of videos by Kevin that highlighted various pieces in the museum. Many of you might not know this, but I think Oberlin was one of the early leaders in using videos to help bring the museum to people who couldn't otherwise get there because the museum was closed. So what a revelation. Not only did Kevin communicate his great understanding of the art, but he also brought the collection to life. Speaking in a clear, organized manner, he provided you with the context of the art, as well as providing hidden gems of information that helped you think and remember what he was saying. Finally, his choices were so relevant. And as someone from Oberlin from the 70s, relevancy was really important. One of my favorites, if you can just bear with me, was about the Chinese folk hero, Zhonghui, known as Shoji in Japan. Now, Zhonghui is probably one of the ugliest creatures in creation, and none of this art was beautiful. But Kevin brought it to life by talking about his backstory as a guardian, as a ghost buster, as a vanquisher of demons, and as a protector from disease. And I tell you, by the end of his talk, I was ready to go out and invest in a Zhonghui poster to put on my door to protect the house from COVID. After seeing his videos and being impressed by his approach and knowledge, I recommended him to the Freer Sackler, and recently he spoke to the docents there and was really one of the most popular speakers we've had in a long time. So you can see why I'm one of Kevin's greatest fans, and I'm thrilled he's going to talk to us tonight about another relevant topic, sustainability, and how you can see the roots of efforts to live in a sustainable way from Japanese prints from over 200 years ago. And what could be more relevant or appropriate than to have a lecture on Green Japan by a curator whose name is Greenwood. So on that note, I'll say thank you so much for being here, Kevin, and we look forward to your talk.
Well, Karen, thank you so much. That was an absolutely lovely introduction. I'm really excited to be here to speak to you again. I got to speak to your group a few years ago on the Mary Ainsworth exhibition that traveled to Japan, and I'm really happy to come and speak to you again. And thanks to Karen and to Clyde for organizing this talk. I've popped a couple of things into the chat. If you click on the chat, there's a link to a video about the sustainability efforts at Oberlin. There's a link to an article in Bloomberg about the same topic, but how it's been financed, the kind of creative ways. And then there's also a link to the carbon neutral page at Oberlin, things that I'm going to reference in my talk today. So the talk, as you can see, is called Green Japan, Viewing Ukiyo-e Landscape Prints Through the Lens of Environmental Sustainability. So I'd like to begin today with a quick overview of the college's sustainable infrastructure project. And there are many more details in the links that I just gave you. Given the pandemic, I doubt that many of you have been back to campus in a while, but take it from me, there's been a lot of construction here on campus over the past year. And you can see, right in front of the Mud Library there is a lot of digging going on. There's lots of trucks and lots of digging and lots of pipes throughout the summer. It was a pretty exhaustive program, but worth it, I think. It's all been part of the college's ambitious plan of achieving carbon neutrality by 2025. In other words, reducing the college's greenhouse emissions to zero, or otherwise balancing emissions to zero through additional means like sequestration and offsets, but as few of those as possible. Now, many of these efforts include dramatic high-tech solutions like the geothermal wells that are being built now with all those tubes and all that digging. And the solar array that's near the North Athletic Fields on college property, built around 2014. That solar array produces about 12% of the college's electricity usage. It's in an area, it's about 10 acres, so it's like roughly the size of Tappan Square, if you can imagine Tappan Square covered with solar panels. And there's a great hiking trail around it. It's an even 2 miles if you're charting your progress. There are also green buildings on campus, like the very, very well-known Adam Joseph Lewis Center, built in 2000, one of the first really green buildings. It's a showcase for green design with passive heating and cooling, solar panels, and the living machine water treatment system that treats all the water in and out of the building. You can see students working on part of that green machine right there, the living machine, excuse me. There are even more subtle green projects, like our very own Allen Memorial Art Museum, which was renovated in 2005 to upgrade mechanical, lighting, space, and climate control systems, adding, among other things, our own geothermal wells on the north side of the building that help to reduce our carbon footprint by 75%, and giving us the coveted gold standard, the LEED gold certification for a historic building built in the main part in 1917. It was pretty impressive. But the sustainable mission is not limited to these very visible high-tech solutions. The Office of Environmental Sustainability also helps to promote and manage many other campus programs, from education and policy to carpooling to recycling, to name just a few of the low-tech behavioral adaptations to sustainable efforts. And I hasten to point out, notice that the albino squirrel at the top of your screen there. Well, I'm happy to report the albino squirrels are back. They had disappeared from Tappan Square for a while, and just in the past year or two, they've come back. During the pandemic, I see this as a very positive sign. In fact, if you know Chinese tradition, Chinese mythology and history, there's the story of the Qiling, which is this magical beast that only appears when the emperor is wise and compassionate and far-seeing and all that kind of stuff. So the appearance of the albino squirrels I see as somehow akin to the appearance of the chiling, maybe a vote of confidence in President Ambar and all of her wonderful efforts at the college. So all of these low-tech efforts reminded me of a fascinating book that I was introduced to by a colleague in 2012. And you see it here on the screen. It's called Just Enough by the author Asby Brown. And it lays out the ways that people in Japan at the beginning of the Edo period, so that's 1603 to 1868, found themselves in their own environmental crisis. At the beginning of the 17th century, Japan was devastated by years of nearly constant war, a period known as the era of warring states and lasting from 1467 to 1615. The warfare had led to widespread deforestation through clear cutting, as forests of slow growth timber were felled for urban and military building projects. And this in turn led to watershed damage on a large scale, which affected the already limited area in this very mountainous region available for agriculture. And the existing environment seemed unable to support the rapidly growing population, which probably doubled in size from 1600 to 1700, when in 1700 it neared 30 million people. Of course, it's 126 million people today, but this is, pre-industrial, early modern era. But as we will see today in this lecture, the crisis led to solutions that evolved over time, and ones that reflected Japan's traditional ethics of community cooperation, or Ukiyo-e, conservation, use of renewables, and waste reduction. So these are kind of the four key elements that today people in Japan think of as, kind of traditional ideals or traditional practices, but in fact, many of them were really rooted in this particular period and came out of this particular crisis. In fact, certain iconic Japanese traditions that are often thought of in relation to philosophy or aesthetics actually have their roots in the culture of sustainability that developed during the Edo period. And I point here to just a couple of examples. The tradition of kintsugi at the upper left, which is repairing ceramics. If they're very valuable, precious ceramics, you repair them with lacquer covered with gold that even accentuates those repairs and sort of celebrates the age and durability of the piece. But on a lesser scale, simple pots were also repaired and reused, right? Ikebana, the amazing Japanese tradition of flower arrangement. When you think about it, right? I don't know if you've been watching the Gilded Age on HBO and all of these spectacular floral arrangements with thousands of flowers and whatnot. Well, think of Ikebana in contrast, just a few carefully selected flowers and branches and sometimes other kinds of plants arranged in this very delicate, beautiful, and symbolic way, right? But using very few things, right? So again, coming out of this era of restraint. And last but not least, many elements of Japanese interior architecture that we're going to talk about a little bit later in the lecture can also be, as we will see, can also be connected to this culture of sustainability. But where Asby Brown's book and other studies of the period describe and highlight these solutions from the standpoint of agriculture, sociology, demographics, land use, etc., I realized that I could illustrate these practices using the Allen's amazing Japanese woodblock print collection that I introduced to you all the last time I spoke to you, but rooted in the Mary Ainsworth collection that was bequeathed to the college in 1950 after her death. Mary Ainsworth put together one of the most important collections of Japanese woodblock prints of the early 20th century. It was about 1,500 prints in total, and we're really, really privileged to have it at Oberlin. And this, what we're doing in the Green Japan show was really just another way of looking at these prints. Woodblock prints of the Edo period, known as Ukiyo-e, or pictures of the floating world, were a popular mass-produced art form made by, for, and about the everyday people of Japan who lived this sustainable lifestyle. Particularly the landscape prints of the 19th century are probably the best known examples of Japanese art worldwide. Think of, Red Fuji you can see here in the upper right, or maybe the Great Wave from the same series by the artist Katsushika Hokusai. And they have been studied in great depth, covering their aesthetics and styles and materials and techniques of production, the artists and craftspeople who made them, and of course the subject matter. But one aspect of the subject matter of these landscape prints has not been emphasized in previous studies. How many of the prints reveal, even unintentionally, the practices that were in place in the 19th century in Japan that made a sustainable civilization, and how the people there responded to a crisis with creativity, with cooperation, and with style. So here's an example to start, right? A beautiful print by Utagawa Hiroshige, one of the most prolific and famous later ukiyo-e masters of the 19th century, of the mid-19th century. Typically, a print like this would be analyzed as this wonderful example of composition, right? It's in this tight vertical format, and the artist has used these wonderful intersecting diagonals to create this beautifully balanced empty space and positive space, negative and positive space. People might talk about the text, right? The text and image that was a big part of these prints, or talk about this moment of quiet contemplation on a snowy day like it is today here in Oberlin, right? But let's talk about the subject matter, right? The image of a lone boatman piloting a raft down the river is so commonplace in landscape prints of the Edo period that's easy to overlook. In fact, for years I've seen them, and I just assumed that this was, kind of like Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, right? It was the cheapest kind of river transportation that was available. However, these rafts were in fact a crucial part of the lumber industry. And this is how timber made its way from distant mountain forests to the brokers in the big cities like Edo, the city that we know today as Tokyo. Although it may have been easier to float individual logs downstream like they do, like they did traditionally in the Pacific Northwest in the US, rafts could be controlled, and they did less damage to riverbanks and river structures that were very built up because of the density of population. They also reduced losses from stranded logs or theft. So it was a little more effort to make and to pilot these rafts, but in the end, it resulted in a better use of the materials. So that's an example of what we're going to do today, looking at these prints in a different way. Now, in the exhibition, Green Japan, I talked about things like rice agriculture, fishing, other sea commodities like salt and seaweed, transportation, forestry, building, rural living, urban living. We don't have time for all of that today, but I'm going to talk instead about some of the key elements, and I hope you find these interesting. So rice agriculture, transportation, forestry, building, and then urban living at the end. And then we'll have questions at the end. So please pop your questions into the chat or save them up for the end. So let's begin with rice agriculture, the basis of the diet, and in the Edo period, or the beginning of the Edo period, the economy. This print of a waterfall, also by Hiroshige, like that last print we saw, highlights one of the important foundations of Japan's agricultural productivity. They have a temperate climate, and they have lots of fresh water from frequent rainfall and from snow melt. And so fresh water, coming down from the mountains or from rainfall was easily collected and saved and channeled, as we're going to see. However, the mountainous terrain of Japan leaves only about 1/4 of the total land available for agriculture. And the majority of that land was used for rice cultivation in the Edo period. One way to expand this was through the construction of, as you can see in this beautiful print, also by Hiroshige, terraced rice fields for wet rice or paddy rice agriculture. The terraced rice fields at Sarashina that you can see here were a famously beautiful spot resembling glistening steps that climb the side of a mountain. They were built not only to expand arable land, but also to take advantage of the snow melt that cascaded down the mountainside. Gravity did most of the irrigation work. The water was caught in a holding basin and then released as needed to fill the paddies below. Here's another example of paddy fields that were fit carefully into the available space between two low rows of hills. And you can see really a highway in the background with people walking back and forth, and of course, Mount Fuji in the distance. The farmers are planting rice in the foreground. You can see a basket with rice seedlings sitting on a berm nearby in the kind of in the mid foreground there. Wet rice was labor intensive, but the labor came from people, not animals. It became clear early on that any agricultural land needed to be used for supporting people and not livestock. And the Edo diet was therefore primarily plant-based. And protein came from things like, tofu, or from fish, seafood. The first step in rice production involved plowing and hoeing and fertilizing the fields, most often using composted plants, industrial byproducts like sardine or rapeseed meal, and most importantly, manure. And due to the relative lack of livestock, this manure was mostly human. It was collected locally in rural areas, but also from cities, and it was carefully processed. And in fact, the collection of manure from the cities contributed to the higher level of sanitation and the lower incidence of diseases like cholera in Japan compared to Europe or America at the same time, or the Americas at the same time. So that we'll come back to that idea of manure collection a little bit later. So next, the fields were flooded, as we can see in this beautiful print by Keisai Eisen. And they were flooded either by knocking a break in the earth berm to let in water, or as we see in this print, using a weir. The English term is weir, the Japanese word is seki, which is a small adjustable wooden dam, and the blocking board can be lifted up or down as needed to allow the water to flood the fields. And you can see these little boys are kind of playing in the water. One has a turtle. You can see a woman sort of kneeling over, and she's cleaning off it's a big pot used for cooking rice. And in the background, another woman is sipping tea, kind of watching over the boys. It's a scene of spring. You can see a blossoming plum tree over there on the right, another sign of spring. While the field is being prepared and flooded, bound bales of seed rice that you can see in the distance there, those sort of yellowish, clumps. Those are bales of wrapped up seed rice. Those are soaked in the pond to allow sprouting. And after about 20 days of soaking, the bales are ready to be opened up, and the seedlings are carefully removed for planting by hand in the fields. And here we see on a sort of a miserable rainy day, people planting rice in a paddy field. So traditional wet rice field cultivation uses a flooded field surrounded by earth berms to keep in the water. Rice can grow there, but not weeds, because it's constantly in water. And the water attracted insects, which in turn attracted frogs and fish, who attracted other species, which created this complex seasonal ecosystem. Seedlings grew for about 40 days in a nursery bed. They were planted densely, but kept evenly spaced, often with the aid of a grid of ropes that would be laid across the seedling bed. And when ready, the farmers carefully uprooted the rice plants and transplanted them more widely spaced in the larger rice fields. And to make sure the plants would take, the seedlings had to be transplanted almost immediately, so very rapidly. And planters kept up the pace and their spirits with numerous planting songs that you can find on YouTube if you look for rice planting songs in Japan. The great tradition there. So at harvest time, the community came together again to perform this labor-intensive task as they did for planting. Bent over with sickles, the rice stalks are cut very close to the bottom to ensure a good length for the straw left over after the rice grains are removed. And we'll talk about rice straw in just a second. The next step is threshing the stalks to remove the grains, either beating them with flails or stripping them by hand. The grains are then hulled in a mill, removing the outer hull of the grain. And finally, the hulls are separated from the grain by winnowing that we'll talk about in just a second. For the farmers, self-sufficient and able to live on the food that they produced, the rice harvest was a central part of their livelihood. A quarter to a half of their yield was actually used for taxes or to pay rent to the landowners. For the rest, part was eaten, part was saved as seed for the next year, and part was sold or exchanged. Whole grain rice today that we know as brown rice was mixed with other grains and was the staple of the rural diet. Polished rice or white rice, what we call white rice, was preferred for its taste, was easier to preserve and ship, and was highly in demand in the cities. It was also more expensive, but it was also less nutritious, leading to widespread vitamin B deficiency in the city, something that's written about a lot in diaries and other texts of the time. So people in the countryside were actually a little bit healthier based on lifestyle and diet. Now, winnowing the rice grains, or separating the inedible hulls from the edible grain, was most simply done by pouring the rice out of a special scoop-like basket and then letting the wind blow the hulls away. So you wait for a nice windy day to do that. Other methods used a special device. And in the foreground of this print is one. It's called a mangoku. And you can see it's got like a big wheel with a handle on it. This was, in fact, the most advanced winnowing tool in the Edo period. It was a frame with a large round drum attached to a central handle. And if you look closely, you can see a woman pouring with the arrow. A woman is pouring rice into the opening at the top. And when she cranked the handle, the drum rotated and created a strong airflow that blew apart the heavier rice from the lighter hulls that had been separated through, through flailing or some other process. Both the hulls and the rice emerged separately below, and you can see a guy in the lower left of the mangoku who's picking up a little woven mat that has his rice or the hulls on it. The device was too expensive for most farms, but in this print, we can see an enterprising roadside shop that made it available to local farmers. And probably the shopkeeper took a portion of the rice in trade for its use. Even the rice hulls were not wasted. They were used for various things, such as stuffing pillows or as an abrasive for scrubbing or polishing. And finally, the hulls ended up as fuel or for compost for the fields. Now, I mentioned rice straw a moment ago. This was not simply a byproduct of rice production, but rice straw, or wara in Japanese, were the dried stalks of rice plants. And you can see them drying here in a little stack in the distance of this wonderful print by Katsushika Hokusai from the 36 Views of Mount Fuji, that famous series that includes the Great Wave. So wara, or dried rice stalks, were among the most versatile and useful plants or materials of the Edo period. They were frequently used to make rope, but they were also used to make sandals and floor mats and cushions and pouches and bags and aprons, and even, as we'll see, raincoats. These items could be roughly or finely woven, depending on what was needed, and they were lightweight, flexible, and surprisingly durable. For farmers, making such products was another potential source of extra income. Now, another important thing that we can see in this same print are reeds. So reeds were another important renewable material. They were used to thatch roofs for the most part in rural areas. They were often grown on otherwise unusable hillsides that couldn't be used for rice production. And after drying, it was widely used as an inexpensive, if labor-intensive, thatching for roofs. Such roofs could be patched easily when needed. They lasted about 20 years, which is about the same as shingle roofs, right, that we have, as I know, because ours needs replacing. And both rice straw and reeds, of course, were completely renewable. You can see the stacks of reeds by the farmhouse. After they were dried, they were put up in the attic where they would dry further and also be fumigated with smoke that would make them insect resistant. And also they provided a kind of a extra insulation up there in the attic, right? So they had all of these wonderful interconnected benefits. And then after use, the straw and reeds simply became compost or mulch. If used as fuel, even the leftover ash was used for dyes or ceramic glazes, cleaning abrasives, and more. So everything was used. This is a beautiful print of a way station on the Kiso-Kaido Road, which was the mountain road that linked Edo and Kyoto. And it's a rainy day, as you can see, right? Japan is known for its frequent rainfall, of course, and one of the most creative uses for rice straw took advantage of its water repellent quality. Straw rain capes, called mino, often combined with a straw skirt, provided lightweight, if bulky, rain protection. At the center of the print, you can see two figures in mino at the head of a procession of samurai. And they're escorting their lord, who's probably way in the background, either back to his domain or to the city of Edo. The man in front, in blue with the umbrella, was probably the village headman, and he's leading these important visitors to their lodging for the night. The shopkeepers, as you can see, and other travelers are kneeling as their military overlords pass by. Another figure in a mino cape, one of these rain capes, you can see kneeling at the lower right. So let's turn now to transportation. As we saw, a samurai procession moving on one of these wonderful roads that were built in the period. In fact, for short or even for long distance land travel in the Edo period, walking was by far the most common form of transportation, as certainly the most environmentally friendly, right? If we look closely at many of the landscape prints that we're seeing today, you can see that most of the figures are traveling on foot. And the main reason for that, of course, was the low number of draft animals, as we discussed before, the low number of draft animals in use. By the 18th century, the population of Japan was so great that very little arable land could be spared to grow food for animals to eat or for labor. So people stepped up, literally, and did most of the transportation of goods and of people. Now, ox carts were used for moving really heavy things, but only in the cities. In fact, and most really heavy things were moved by water. In fact, any wheeled vehicles were prohibited on the major highways because the roads were unpaved and they were easily torn up by these heavy loads and the wheels of the carts. So again, outside of the cities, we're talking about moving on foot, maybe horses. Horses were mostly restricted to middle and high-ranking samurai, although pack horses or riding horses led by a groom on foot could be rented by the regular population for day trips. But again, they weren't that common. For most people, the only option to walking was a sedan chair or kago. And we can see one of them here. So it's basically a chair, it's a seat that's mounted below a pole and carried by two bearers, and pretty healthy fellas, I imagine. And here we have an excellent view of the very busy accounting house that managed transportation on this section of the Tokaido, which was the other main route, the coastal route between Edo and Kyoto. This is where the porters and bearers and horses could be changed out for the next leg of travel. I love this print. It's actually a really tiny little print. It's kind of a small format print, but there's a lot going on. You can see over here at the right, a group of porters are traveling while they're wiping off sweat. Next to them, two porters are checking a load down here, while another man is cleaning dirt from a horse's hoof down there. In the foreground, a load is being removed from a pack horse, and behind, a third horse is being watered from a round trough. At the left are two types of sedan chairs. One is the more common open style, and you can see a man seated in there waiting for one bearer to stop arguing in the background with the dispatcher, probably in blue. Inside the accounting, and you can see another like closed type of kago. which would be for a more elite traveler, or maybe oftentimes women were supposed to be kept a little more, particularly women of the samurai class, kept more private. Inside the accounting house, we can see two standing customers making travel arrangements, while the other dispatchers seated on a platform are surrounded by paperwork, right? Wonderful image. So let's take a deep breath and turn now to forestry, which was a really important part of the sustainable practices, and in fact was the one of the main things that had to change after the wars of the Warring States period. So as I noted before, in the beginning of the Edo period, overexploitation of forest resources, particularly from clear cutting of the most desirable old growth, had led to a crisis, as the forest could not recover effectively. After an initial period of a tree census, they literally sent folks out to count the trees and list how big and how old they were, that kind of thing. And there were initially really overly harsh restrictions on forest use. This was followed by local protest. And then eventually the Edo government developed a more flexible arrangement for long-term sustainable mixed use. Local administrators oversaw the forests, they enforced the rules, they judged disputes, but they also supervised forest management and replanting. Now, rural villagers had access to the lower forests of broadleaf trees and bamboo, and they were able to gather firewood in those places, but only what had fallen naturally. The upper, deeper forests with the big conifers like cryptomeria and cypress, those were reserved by the government for urban building. Commercial logging of the upper forest was done by isolated lumberjack communities, lived deep in the forest. They cut down the trees. They sent them downhill on slides that were themselves made out of logs. And then those logs were eventually taken up, those slides were taken apart and sent on with the other logs. And the logs were lashed together into rafts to float them downriver to the cities, as I noted before. And then in the cities, guilds of brokers and dealers sold them for building projects. The complexities of this regulatory system were smoothed out by adaptability to local conditions, flexibility from the government, support for people to file claims or grievances, and of course, a general cultural commitment to reducing waste and respecting long-term needs. In this wonderful print by Hiroshige from the Kiso Kaido series, or one of the Kiso Kaido series, we can see two probably rural villagers who have been collecting firewood, fallen firewood out in the forest. The guy on the right, you can see he's got a little thing next to him. That's actually a saw with a sheath on it. They've made a little fire and they're sitting there relaxing. And what I think is happening is they are probably the fathers of the two boys that have been made to carry the actual firewood on these big baskets on their backs, right? It builds their character, I'm sure. In the background, you can see a man kind of walking on the road, but we also see where one of those big, old growth trees has been cut down and sent down the hill. They're seated on one that's maybe about to be sent a little bit later. But you can see how this tree has been preserved. It's going across the walkway, but they've built this little frame to support it, because maybe they're not ready to cut it, or it's simply to protect the people passing by. Here's another one of these wonderful prints, a typical daily sight in Edo of a rafter who's moving those logs to market. You can see he's got a little like A-frame tent there that's protecting his fire on a hibachi, like a little metal tray that he's got a fire on that he can use to make some tea or dinner, or maybe warm himself a little bit when it gets cold. And here is this wonderful view in the wintertime, looks a lot like Oberlin today, of the lumber yards. So the lumber yards, or kiba, in Fukagawa, which is on the east side of the Sumida River in Edo, in what we today call Tokyo. This was home to about 500 different lumber brokers and a number of large wholesale guilds. And both the rough-hewn logs that were brought in and the processed lumber that went out used Edo's waterways for easy transport of these heavy materials. So the riverside location of Fukagawa was ideal. In fact, much of the land here was reclaimed from swamps and was built up as the lumber industry grew. The high water table had additional benefits. If you think about it, it was a check on termite nests, right? All this water, and they kept the wood sort of floating in the water, then the termites couldn't get to it. And the many waterways in the area also acted as a fire break, right? If fire broke out, it wouldn't spread very far because these waterways act as a fire break to protect these very valuable assets. So the last part of our talk today, we're going to talk about building and how different aspects of traditional Japanese architecture can be related to sustainability, and then we'll stop for questions at the end. So this, when you think of sort of archetypal Japanese architecture, right? This is probably what you think of, right? This is a wonderful illustrated scene from the play Chushingura, the story of the 47 Ronin or masterless samurai. Maybe you're familiar with that story. It's a famous tale. But we're using it here because it gives us a glimpse into the residential compound of a high-ranking samurai. The buildings include elements often considered standard to traditional architecture in Japan, but which are really characteristic of a specific style of architecture called shoin zukuri, or shoin style. And this was common to the samurai class in the Edo period and for the wealthier townspeople. There are many different styles of architecture in Japan, but this is probably the most famous. For the samurai, part of their property was typically devoted to vegetable gardens and fruit trees because the samurai class were expected to be both frugal and relatively self-sufficient to kind of grow much of their own food. Women managed the household and made clothes for the family, but were largely required to stay home. It was considered, appropriate for them not to leave the home. So traveling peddlers were a common sight in the districts of the samurai. They would bring varied goods to these customers, particularly in Edo, where ostentation in samurai residences was disapproved of. The houses tended to be one-story with low-slung tiled roofs, and the interiors were similarly modest, as we can see in this print. Now, the woman in the foreground is standing on what's called an engawa, which is a raised porch-like space that often surrounds buildings and has all kinds of great functions in traditional Japanese architecture. But what I want to point out here, not so much the engawa, but what the engawa is supported on. These supporting posts underneath are resting on carefully shaped and mass-produced stone blocks. And these became widespread in the period, and they helped to preserve the wood from rot and from termites, in contrast to earlier periods where the wood just rested on the ground and it was easy for termites and for moisture to get into the wood. So this little technological development really added to the sustainability of the wood that was used and the longevity of the wood beams and posts. The wide eaves that we see that cover the engawa also created passive heating or cooling. So, for example, when the sun is high in the summer, they give shade, and when it's low in the winter, they allow the sunlight to penetrate into the interior. And I want you to note the screens here that are also a part of showing zukuri. Let's talk about screens for just a moment. Shoji are the translucent screens that you can see here. They're made with thick paper over a wood and bamboo frame, and they provided some privacy, but also translucency to allow light to penetrate into the interiors of these buildings. The openness of the interiors, though, and the permeability of inside and outside spaces allowed light and air to circulate. And this is something that was also made possible by the temperate climate of Japan, right? It wasn't super cold, but got pretty hot. So you wanted to have that kind of air circulation. And that permeability of inside outside was something that people like Frank Lloyd Wright and others were so inspired by And, for them, it was kind of an aesthetic thing, but it also was rooted in this idea of improving light and air circulation. Another feature seen in these prints of the interior spaces are empty interior spaces, right? People sat on the tatami floors, and let me just give you some of the terminology here. So tatami down there at the bottom. And there were typically not permanent pieces of furniture in each room. And this allowed a flexibility for the rooms, which could be changed as needed by using sliding screens that you could open or close, close for privacy, opened up for, larger numbers of people. They could even be removed for larger gatherings. The elegant minimalism that Japanese traditional interiors are so admired for was really rooted in practicality, right? Even the use of tatami as a floor covering, we think of that as, this stylistic thing. It helped to economize on wood, as it allowed builders to make the floors underneath out of unpolished, irregular boards, and not, these carefully smooth, beautiful planks of wood that you see used decoratively in other parts of a Japanese home. But under most of the floors, under most of the tatamis, the floors are kind of rough. Tatami, as well as the clay plaster used on the walls, also helped to regulate humidity as it absorbed and released extra water, when things were wet or dry, depending. So all of these things were kind of interconnected. In fact, the mortise and tenon joinery that was used to create all of these buildings, everything is fitted together with mortise, very elaborate mortise and tenon forms. They don't use nails, right? This takes extra effort, of course. It takes skill and knowledge and training, but it economizes on metals and is more resilient in earthquakes. If you think about it, mortise and tenon, they have a little bit of give to them, whereas a nail, if it's pulled out, it's going to stay out, and little by little would be pulled completely out. So it allows resiliency during the frequent earthquakes that are found in Japan. So let's turn now to structures related to urban living and urban living in general. Now, although 80% of the population lived in rural villages, and we've seen a lot of examples of rural life up to this point, let's turn to some of the sustainable adaptations made in urban areas in Edo, Japan. And I want to start with fresh water. Edo was located on a plain near a large bay, today called Tokyo Bay. Back then it was Edo Bay. And the space was ideal due to its access to large rivers that emptied there. However, as the population of the city grew, it became clear that more water was needed. Well water that was so near the bay was too salty. So the government built a large and sophisticated infrastructure to get water from the rivers and ponds that were distributed throughout the city. 4 major aqueducts were constructed to move water down canals. And this print shows the Tama River Aqueduct, which was the longest at over 50 miles. And it served the southernmost populous part of the city of Edo. The water went from canals to stone pipes and finally into underground watertight wooden pipes. These delivered water to local, quote unquote wells. And these wells were essentially a series of settling tanks that helped to remove sediment. They'd go from one tank to the next, and the settlement would slowly settle out. And then they would get, fresh water out of those. All of these sections were easily accessible for periodic cleaning. And of course, most water was boiled for tea or for cooking, making fresh water safer and more available than in any European city of the same era. Another practice that kept Edo period cities generally cleaner than those elsewhere in the world related to the lack of draft or food animals that I noted earlier. A major source of fertilizer was human manure, and it was highly valuable and carefully collected. Farmers negotiated with urban landlords to have exclusive rights to carry off manure, originally in trade for produce, but later for cash. And it's kind of interesting, but different manure was more valuable. The manure that they got from the pleasure districts, right, from the actors and the performers, and you know, in the red light district, that kind of thing, was considered richer because they had a richer diet in those areas. So actors' poo was more valuable in this context. This also meant that the gutters in the streets were just for wastewater, either for runoff from rain or for after household use. And these gutters were checked and cleared frequently to control any overflow. You know, so basically just leaves and stuff would gather in there and not, you know, manure and runoff. Now, perhaps not surprisingly, it's hard to find beautiful ukiyo-e prints that highlight the important contribution of manure collection to urban sanitation. But there is a small detail in this print, also from the famous play Chushingura, that relates. This boat that you can see in this back alley is a type of boat called a kasai bune. And this was a boat that was used to collect the manure that was collected by you know, the farmers that were, you know, or the manure collectors. And you can see this photograph, and I give the source up at the top. Those big buckets would be carried on shoulder poles, and this is how they collected the manure using that little dipper that you can see, or long dipper, I should say big dipper, that was used to, you know, go down into the outhouses, collect the manure, put it in the buckets, then transport, pour it into these vessels, and then they were taken off to the countryside to be used in agriculture. The very last thing I want to talk about is the urban residence called a machiya, that just means urban residence. Let me tell you a little bit about the population in Edo. The city of Edo was vast. It had a population of about 1 million people, 1.3 million to be exact. More than half of them, about 650,000, were of the samurai class. And they're, along with the 200 lords that spent part of the time in the city of Edo. Townspeople, you know, the urban townspeople were about 44%. So about 570,000, and clerics and others made up the rest. However, the city was tightly segregated and it was not evenly divided. The lords controlled about 33% of the land for their big palaces, and they had 3 different residences in the city that were at various stages away from the palace, you know, where they'd have to go for meetings and things. The other samurai, the regular warriors, were about 30%. They had about 30% of the land. So right away, that's 63% of the land for just the samurai class. Temples and shrines had about 13% of the land. And the townspeople, despite making up about 44% of the population, they had about 18% of the area. This meant that their districts were densely populated, their residences were tightly packed together, and their surroundings were very bustling and noisy. The dirt streets could get muddy, but the rain was quickly absorbed by the streets. The streets, of course, were free of manure or even rotting trash that was typical in other countries of the era. All of it was hauled out for composting. The streets were also, as much as possible, laid out in a grid system, which organized urban residences into blocks. Blocks had streets on all 4 sides with a large central open square in the middle that was opposite the street-facing buildings. This could be a gathering space in case of fires or earthquakes, but it could also be a quiet retreat. It was often used for vegetable gardens and shade trees, and also allowed better and cooler airflow from the street to pass through the buildings. For wealthier townspeople, a plot could be to house a single family or a shop with an upstairs residence. And for other working people, plots could be subdivided into multiple one-room living spaces with toilets, wells, and public baths that were shared. Most plots were long and narrow from the street to the rear square. And this was due to the fact that plots were taxed on the basis of their street frontage, right? So they tended to have, sort of they tended to be thin and narrow. Let's take a quick look at this great diagram of a machiya. You can see in the front where the shop would be located if it were a shop. We move back a little bit further into the interior where the residence was located. And then way in the back with thick walls, carefully plastered, was the storehouse that was designed to protect the goods from thieves, but also from fires, which were really common and dangerous. Well, you'll notice that there are these beautiful little interior gardens that were open to the sky, and they provided natural cooling as well as light and air circulation into the interiors that would otherwise be really, really dark and kind of stuffy. I've got a great photograph from a modern machiya that's been preserved that gives you a sense of, how potentially beautiful these little gardens could be, right? They're simple, they're understated, they're unpretentious and elegant, all related to the Edo period aesthetic ideal of shibumi, right? Of simplicity and elegance. And I think it's a great example of it, taking advantage of elements from tea gardens, tea ceremony gardens that I wish we had more time to talk about. Here's another beautiful example from the Tawaraya Inn in Kyoto, a traditional inn. Rear gardens were larger, but equally serene. Here's a beautiful one from the Nose residence. You can see how little these screens could be hung in the summertime to kind of filter the light a little bit, but absolutely stunning. So let me kind of conclude here. More than half of the population of Edo, as I said, around 650,000 were samurai, 200 lords or daimyo. The lords controlled 33% of the area, other samurai 30%. The lowest ranking samurai lived together in barracks, while those of the middle and higher ranks, mostly administrators, lived in spacious compounds in the suburbs. The most dramatic and impressive urban residences were certainly castles, these massive fortified structures that were the homes of the regional lords or daimyo. With colossal stone walls at their base, the upper structures had walls of thick planks filled in with sand and gravel to slow bullets if they were attacked. Heavy plaster and ceramic tile roofs protected from fire. However, during the long and peaceful Edo period, castles were more symbols of authority and no longer really needed for defense. The largest and most famous surviving castle in Japan is Himeji Castle, which is not in Edo, but northwest of Osaka, a little bit further south. And this print shows the building of the central tower in 1581. And you'll note that the scaffolding used to construct it is bamboo. Bamboo, this incredibly versatile material, fully renewable, used for myriad functions throughout East Asia, still today often used for scaffolding to make skyscrapers. These take advantage of the fact that bamboo is very strong, but also very lightweight. And I'd also like to use this print to kind of bring us toward a conclusion. Now, lest I be accused of presenting an overly rosy picture or idealized picture of the period, remember that Edo Japan was ruled by a military dictatorship, more or less benign, but definitely not a democracy. And many of the sustainable practices I've covered here related to forestry, land use, transportation, and building were brought into being by the decree and the regulations of this military government. A subtext of the exhibition and I guess of this talk is really, I see this as kind of a cautionary tale, right? As we find ourselves careening toward a climate-induced crisis of our own, and the tough choices about investing in the future, so much to be admired here at Oberlin College, are not being adopted more widely or with the urgency that many feel is required. And that makes me worry, right? Are our political options limited to either a gridlocked and apparently ineffectual democracy or an oppressive but seemingly effective authoritarianism, right? I worry that with rapidly declining conditions, that decision will be made for us. But on a more optimistic note, I would direct you to the work of author Kim Stanley Robinson, among the foremost writers today in the science fiction subgenre known as cli-fi. In many of his works, humanity deals with the impact of climate change and the ensuing political violence and social upheaval through the most important response seen among the people of the Edo period Japan that we have seen illustrated in many of these prints today, community cooperation as a cultural value. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to click out so I can see all of your faces and oh, there we go, and see if we have any questions. I'd be happy to take them either in the chat or verbally, however you want to do it.